Good Monday morning. Yes, we are going to take a look at translations again because of an email that came in. Like I said last week, whenever emails come in with questions, I do try to get to them here and try to answer the person personally if I can. This one was a new one for me. They said, can you compare Ephesians 6:12 in the Geneva Bible versus the King James Bible? So let me do some groundwork first, shall I? The first Bible to be printed in the English language was called the Great Bible. It was also called the King's Bible. Some even called it the Chained Bible because every church was required by law to have a copy of one, and it was chained to the pulpit so nobody could take it. That was around 1535. It had a lot of problems. Miles Coverdale translated it, which was a great work of scholarship. But he did not go back to the Hebrew and the Greek and the Aramaic at all. He didn't have that option. I believe I'm accurate in saying that. So he translated it from Latin works and other works that were already out there. In other words, his Bible, the Great Bible, was a revision of a revision of a revision rather than a trying to go back to the earliest source material we have. For those of you that don't know, we have no original works of any of the Bibles. None of them. We have nothing written by John, Paul, David, none of these. What we have are the copies of the books that they wrote or the Psalms they wrote. And sometimes those copies are hundreds of years later after they wrote them, sometimes many hundreds of years. New Testament, only about 100 years. But still, we don't have the originals. And it's important to know that. And I've had people say, well, we understand that there are differences and discrepancies among the versions that we have, but the originals were perfect in all their ways. Well, that has to be said completely on faith because there's no evidence for it. And that's why you've never heard me state that from the pulpit. Well, not in the last 25, 30 years. You've not heard me state that because we don't have them. It seems to be a great jump to make that determination. So, Tyndale's work was a revision of a revision of a revision several times over. The reaction against it was pretty harsh, but it was a very difficult political time. Catholics decided that they needed to redo it because Tyndale had not been as supportive of the popes in some of his translation, although he was supportive of the popes. He tried to be. They said, no, it needed more. And so they made their version of the Bible. They made two different. The Bishop's Bible was the first one. And then the, Reims something Bible followed shortly after. Then it was obvious, well, we've got all these Bibles and they don't agree with each other. We need to have a more solid version and one which is more forceful in speech. Now, I'm not sure why they wanted something more forceful, but they got it. A bunch of people, Protestants, had fled into Europe, in particular Switzerland, to the city of Geneva, which was run by John Calvin. And they decided to take all available manuscripts that they had, which were not nearly as many as we have today, and make a true version of Scripture. That was the Geneva Bible. Now, the Geneva Bible was first printed in England in 1575, but the version which you can generally access, for example, if you go to BibleGateway.com or Bible.ca, you should be able to get the Geneva Bible. That one is a 1599, which is the authoritative version. It's the one which all of the kinks have been sorted out and the mistakes had been fixed. If you look at a verse there, you will find it is rather difficult to read because it is in 1599-ish. So I didn't decide to put these up. I don't have that tech here in my office. But you can look at it. Again, BibleGateway.com is free, so is Bible.ca. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers. All of that tracks almost certainly with whatever version you're reading. And against the worldly governors. Now, the The word governors there is spelled very creatively in the Geneva Bible because English spelling had not been really established. It was still up for grabs at this time. Shakespeare did a lot to make the language come into to line saying this is how we say this, and he made up a bunch of words which are now words in our language. So we owe him something there. Against the worldly governors, the princes of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickednesses which are in ye high places. Well, the King James Version's not that very much different. It says, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers. All of that's word by word. That it's a complete match. And then instead of against the worldly governors, it says against the rulers of the darkness of this world. Now, that could be very different. You know, the worldly governors that would seem to think that we're supposed to be fighting against our political leaders if they're not Christian, which, by the way, was a widely held belief at that time, to take up arms against your monarch. And when the Great Bible was written and the Geneva Bible was written, there was a lot of killing of monarchs going on. The Geneva Bible, for example, became the primary Bible of British Protestantism. Shakespeare used it, John Knox used it, John Donne, D-O-N-N-E, pronounced Dunn, poet and writer, used it. It was all over Scotland because it came out of Geneva, John Calvin, so John Knox takes it to Scotland. Scotland was very much Calvinist, Presbyterian, and so in fact there was a law in Scotland that any house that had the means to own a copy had to have a copy. So that was interesting. It was brought on the Mayflower over to America. For those of you that are not Americans, the Mayflower was one of the wooden ships that brought pilgrims and Puritans across to the American colonies back in the 1600s. And so that Bible made it here. It was the first Bible that we know of to make it in America. But it's not really known so much for its translation today as for its notes and annotations, the little things written to explain the text. And those were very Calvinist and Puritan. They are the reason why the Geneva Bible didn't live that long, because they really took away from the text, and they were forceful. And the word, the phrase used by one scholar is that the Geneva Bible drove the Great Bible from the stage by its forcefulness. Yeah, it did. But it wasn't so much the text as it was the notes, the annotations, which were very Calvinist, very Puritan in the way they were written. And in reaction to that, the King James Version was made. King James didn't want anything to do with this. He had seen how this had worked with Henry VIII, through Elizabeth I, through the death of Mary, the murder of Mary, Queen of Scots, and James I then created the Authorized Bible, what we today call the King James Version. And it was in reaction to the Geneva Bible to take out some of the pro-Catholic leanings that Tyndale had still gotten in there and Calvinists for some reason hadn't gotten out, but also to take out all of the notes and annotations that made you Calvinist or Puritan if you believed them. The reason is that James looked upon Calvinism and Puritanism as an enemy to his government. And so he designed this not to have that in there. He also made some changes. He did not like the word servant, which is what deacon means, or minister. And so because he already had an order in his church called deacon, and he wanted that word to be in there, so he just transliterated diakonos and made it deacon, and that's how it entered our English language. He made several changes that were not beneficial. For example, the word immerse, he changed that because they weren't immersing by 1611. not except for some crazy Puritans. You baptized your babies. There was sprinkling, there was pouring. Those were acceptable. So he did not want the word immersed there. So he took the word baptizo and he transliterated that to baptize and baptism. And that's how we got that word in our language. So we gained a word, but it hid the meaning. He also did that with church. The word church in Scripture, ecclesia, means a gathering. Well, he didn't want a gathering. In fact, gatherings were outlawed if they weren't in official churches. I've stood in the field of Sanquhar, Scotland, where Calvary rode through and murdered men, women, and children for the crime of meeting outside to worship and take communion without the authority of the church. So yeah, this is a real problem. And so these battling Bibles were made to really defend different governors and different places. So that said, what do we know about the differences here? The differences are that the Geneva Bible tends to make you think we can have a go at the worldly leaders, the worldly governors, the princes of the darkness of this world. The way they read that would be the king we don't like, the government we don't like, against spiritual wickednesses which are in ye high places. King James Version, very close, but it says against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places, against powers. Why did they change? Well, in King James did not change this particular passage. They used the oldest Greek and Hebrew manuscripts they could find, which very, very commendable. But the fact is, we have many, many hundreds of older, more complete, more accurate manuscripts than they had available to them, because we keep finding them. And as we find them, we revise and we revise. Speaking of revised, of all the readings, although I don't use it very often in sermons, I usually use the NIV of 2011 because that's the most popular version in the United States. I like the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. They have a Catholic version. They've got the New Revised Standard Version is trying to be all things to all people by making edits. But the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition, is actually really, really good. And it reads this way: "For our struggle is not against blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." That is very accurate. That matches the earliest manuscripts we've got, the most reliable manuscripts we can find. And that removes that idea that in Ephesians 6:12, that we have the authority to attack our politicians, grab an army and go overthrow them because they're not Christian in our way. It turns it entirely into a spiritual struggle, which is exactly what Paul was trying to say. And what he did say. But some of the Bibles along the way were tweaked to fit this king, that queen, rather than what does the scripture really say? And to cut him, I need to cut him slacker with that. That last statement was not terribly fair, because they didn't have the older manuscripts that we have. And our grandchildren will probably have more that we don't have. And so translation is a continual process. I've had people say, why do we need another translation? Some translations come out, I wonder that too. But we will always need new translations because we're always seeking, asking, seeking, knocking, finding, reading, interpreting, and trying to put the words of God down there without our words getting in the way. That's a hard job. So thank God for the translators, for the archaeologists, for those linguists who find them and can read them. And let us all be very humble about the way we interpret them. here's the good news. Any of these would have brought you to Jesus. And if they bring you to faith in Jesus, job done. But it's also nice if it doesn't give you permission to take a sword to your local council member. Right? Right. Have a good week. Cheers.